All right. Thank you everyone for joining the webinar this morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. We really appreciate you joining us to have this really important and vital conversation. I'm going to hand it over to Bridget Burns, who will be our first will be introducing the webinar.
Thank you, Tara. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, as Tara said, for your interest in joining us this morning and thinking more about how women's organizations and women's rights activists and women's funds are thinking about and trying to map engagement in climate finance mechanisms, and also to create space to talk about what these mechanisms are in general and sort of the limits to which mapping them provide in terms of being able to really take action without further resources and capacity. So I'm just going to start by introducing you to who we're going to have speaking today. My colleague Augusta Hagen-Dillon from the Prospera International Network of Women's Funds, and this is a partnership in this report that we did together. My colleague Tara, who you just heard from, who's a program manager here at WEDO, and then our colleague Balor Legjim from the Mongolia Women's Fund, who's going to be providing some firsthand experience of their interaction and engagement with a climate finance mechanism. When thinking about climate finance and why we have, as WEDO and Prospera and other organizations have highlighted this out, is that we know that there are multiple ways in which resources are flowing into different countries towards different projects. And when we talk about climate finance, it's no different from any other type of finance mechanisms that exist out there. This includes loans, grants, equity, and guarantees. It's often discussed in terms of public sources of climate finance versus private sources of climate finance. Sometimes when people talk about generating resources to support climate change activities, they're thinking in the capacity of carbon markets. Other times they're thinking about it in terms of things such as generating resources from taxes and levies on bad products or environmental hazards, for example, or things that cause and drive an excess of greenhouse gas emissions. So we know that currently there is a huge push for reaching a goal of generating $100 billion per year for developing countries to be able to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And I think what's important in that is that 100 billion is actually really nowhere near what we know the scale, especially as feminists who understand that this is an issue of structural change, that we know that that 100 billion is nowhere near the scale that it needs to be. So part of what are the emphasis that we have in terms of how we engage in issues of climate finance is actually doing the analysis to call for further resources. And it's certainly not enough to look at just how much money is actually available. It also is important to look at how much money is going to other things that are helping drive climate chaos. So, for example, to implement the current, what we call NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, which is what countries have put forward under the Paris Agreement of the UN climate negotiations as their commitment to take action on climate change. And some analysis of that has showed we need to invest around 13.5 trillion in energy efficiency and low carbon technologies. So there's already, as I mentioned, a clear disconnect between the 100 billion and the 13.5 trillion in energy. I'm not sure if someone turned their webcam off, but you might want to just X that out, Tara, if possible. In addition to that, there are other priorities that remain unaligned. So the global military expenditure in 2018 was 1.8 trillion, which is actually an increase from the year prior of 2.6%. So again, it's a huge gap from where we need to be. The fact that there are other things that are being invested in, such as 373 billion in fossil fuel subsidies versus 150 billion in renewable energy subsidies. And I think we always like to start out with this because the rest of our analysis is trying to look at what mechanisms do exist, and kind of from two perspectives: how can we make sure they do no harm, and how can we build power to access and really harness those resources towards the solutions that we know are actually effective in combating climate change. So if we go to the next slide, I think that this doesn't necessarily need to be over articulated for this audience, because I know from those of you who registered interest, you really do see and understand the link between climate change and gender equality. And we see how that intersects both in terms of impacts: water scarcity, fuel shortage, food insecurity, disasters, but also as how the responses are implemented. And we know that climate finance doesn't meet the current and future needs, and that if they're not channeled in a way that recognizes the gender inequalities, that they have the potential to exacerbate them. And from a perspective of being actually effectively implemented, we've seen, and Tara and other colleagues can share from the projects that we've seen put forward in different mechanisms right now, where it's clearly one of the faults or the challenges with them is that they're gender blind, or they're not taking into account something crucially important to a project related to agriculture or land. And more importantly, well, not more importantly, but just as important, is the projects themselves are not necessarily being designed in a way that takes into account the solutions and voices of women who already are working on projects that need to be replicated and or scaled. Next slide. Oh, I also wanted to mention, just from that piece, that our colleagues at the Heinrich Böll Foundation have just released a video on what gender responsive climate finance looks like. So we can maybe at the end put that in the chat box and direct you towards it, because I think it's a really useful overview of thinking about what gender responsive climate finance might look like. And so this is just all to say that when because we'll be going through this report itself, but when we do, and the colleagues and civil society groups that we work with think about climate finance activism and what that looks like, we see it in three ways. And I think that it's important that we're always pulling from this perspective of building power and challenging these structural issues from multiple avenues. So direct, meaning we accept and understand the climate finance structures that do exist for trying to advance on the 100 billion per year and trying to direct that 100 billion to developing countries. So what are some strategies that we have to ensure direct access to these funding mechanisms? So for example, are there women's funds who could directly engage as accredited entities to receive and channel funds through that? It's a very technical process. It requires a lot of capacity and support and resources, and these first two, direct and indirect, are part of what the report tries to flow through, as you'll see when my colleague Tara goes through them. The indirect piece is then again trying to hold the mechanisms accountable to ensure that the climate finance that is available isn't doing harm, but also that that there's the opportunity to, through safeguards, through engagement and proper consultation, to design projects that can actually be transformative from a gender perspective. And then while we do this, it isn't losing and making sure we're not forgetting this paradigm shifting piece, which speaks to the pieces that I started when I outlined this, that the flows are not going to where they need to be, and really importantly, they are still being channeled to things that are driving climate chaos. So within the same breath that we look for engagement in certain mechanisms, we also need to be calling out where alternatives, demanding alternatives, whether they're community financial structures or tax justice initiatives, moving the money campaigns to ensure we're decreasing military spend and reinvesting in public and environmental safety protections. This all needs to be part of a feminist approach to working on advocacy around climate finance. Next slide. So this collaboration between, as I mentioned, Prospera and WEDO, I'll let Prospera introduce themselves. For any of you who are not familiar with WEDO, maybe you're coming through a different network. We are a global advocacy organization that really works at this intersection of human rights, gender equality, and the integrity of the environment. We work in multiple different policy processes like the UN climate negotiations or the processes around the Sustainable Development Goals. And we're really trying to use those spaces to build movement, leverage power, build feminist analysis, and really support technical implementation of gender and women's rights language in those spaces. So key takeaways, I would say, we'll come back to this as we go through them from this work, and we're really pleased that you were interested in engaging further in this report. And like anything, both WEDO and Prospera wanted to make sure that when engaging in this kind of research and analysis, to put an information tool together for our networks and partners, that we don't leave it with just that we have opportunities to engage in that analysis to highlight what the key messages are. And so in the outlining of pathways for engagement, we want to be very clear that it's outlining those engagement pathways is certainly not enough to ensure that women's organizations and funds can actually access this climate finance. Critical resources are certainly needed to support additional capacity building and to support the ability for, in different areas, different groups to take up some of these recommendations. And even if widely enacted, it doesn't transform or necessarily get to the overall structural issues within the architecture of the climate finance mechanisms to make sure that it's a gender responsive system. There isn't a single best practice. Whether, how, and to what extent to engage are decisions that really depend on the resources, but also region. And this effort really benefited from the collaboration with many civil society organizations, including many who are on this call itself, excuse me. And so all of that is to say, as we go through these engagements, please feel free to have questions, to raise concerns, or ask for further clarification or information on why this might be a particular useful entry point, or where there might be a missing action or something that your region or your country is either specifically challenged with or would like to focus on in terms of how you engage on climate finance. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Augusta to just introduce Prospera and maybe speak to some of the work that you also do on just the kind of framing of where there are resources at this intersection of women's rights and climate finance. And climate change, excuse me.
Sure. Thank you so much, Bridget, for that introduction. It was really comprehensive. And welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many participants today. Brief introduction about Prospera. We are a network of 38 women's funds, public fundraising foundations that are dedicated to supporting women, girls, trans people, and their communities. And currently we have members in 33 different countries. They work at the national, regional, multi-regional levels, as well as funds that have a more thematic focus, such as FRIDA, the Young Feminist Fund, or FEMI, the International Indigenous Women's Fund. Among many other things, one of Prospera's key roles is to support research and advocacy initiatives in partnership with our members and for our members. And those initiatives sort of focus around different trends and issue areas where our members are working or where they're interested in engaging more. And in recent years, this has been a lot around environmental justice and climate change and the intersection with women's rights. And that was really driven by the fact that increasing numbers of our members had begun to support environmental justice and climate change initiatives, which in turn was driven by both a push and a pull, in the sense that increasing numbers of their grantee partners were reporting that the most pressing issues for women's rights and girls in their context were directly related to the health of their environment. But accessing funding to support those efforts was really challenging, because funding for climate change and environmental protection and sustainability largely ignores, and in some cases can compound existing inequalities, which is something that Bridget spoke about earlier. So really recognizing that, one of the things that we wanted to do as Prospera, as the network, was support our members to understand where there are opportunities to access funding to support these efforts, but also have access to information about what exists, what the sort of larger funding landscape is, and how to support these initiatives more effectively. And we've done a couple of different pieces around that. I won't get into too much detail just because we have limited time. You can go to our website to see the different resources. I will say that it sort of kicked off with a summit that we did in 2014 with Global Green Grants Fund called A Summit for Women and Climate. That was really sort of a first bringing together of women and environmental funders to sort of understand each other's approaches and how we could work together more going forward. A number of different pieces have come out of that. Most recently, we again partnered with Global Green Grants to do a report to look at funding levels for women in the environment. That was published in 2017, and it found that in 2014, just 0.2% of all global foundation funding was invested at the intersection of women and the environment, and that represented less than 0.1% of all foundation grants. So even though we see that there is growing recognition of the importance of this intersection and increasing initiatives taking place there, funding is really not matching that sort of awareness. And so as was mentioned, the multiple strategies are needed to try and shift this. And so Prospera is continuing to try and build the bridge between funders of women's rights and environmental funders and climate change funders. A lot of that is focused in the sort of private foundation sphere. At the same time, what we see is that some of the biggest funding for climate change is public climate financing mechanisms, and that largely remains out of reach to women's organizations and women's funds. And that's partially that although they have sort of frameworks and policies set up to address gender equality, structurally they're not set up to fund small organizations. And a lot of our members were really interested in understanding how they could access this funding, particularly around the Green Climate Fund, which is perhaps the largest and most well-known mechanism. And so we really felt like the first step was to support access to information so that women's funds and their partners could make educated decisions about where to focus their energy, their strategies, and limited capacities, and engage in the way that made the most sense for them as institutions. And WEDO is a natural partner in this, given their expertise and knowledge of climate finance and mutual interest area. Initially, this report was really going to just be focused on the Asia Pacific region. I think as we worked on it, we realized that there were lessons and valuable information for the entire sort of community of women's organizations and funds. And so we sort of decided to not have that specific focus. We also really wanted to include practical examples from those who have tried to engage and what they've learned from that process, because we find that that can be some of the sort of most effective learning. So I'm excited we'll be hearing from Balor later on today from the Mongolian Women's Fund. This is very much a first step. We're really looking forward to seeing how we can take it forward. There are a number of different recommendations in the report, but I do look forward to hearing from those who are on the webinar today for other ideas as well. So I'll stop there and looking forward to hearing from everyone later.
Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, Augusta. I think that was a really helpful overview, and I think it's fine if we just jump in and keep going. And so I'll pass back over to you, Tara.
Thank you, Bridget. So as we were diving into this report, we really wanted to think about three primary things. First of all, outlining the history and the context of what's happening with gender policies and procedures and considerations of gender across these four funds that we focused on: the Adaptation Fund, the Climate Investment Funds, or CIF, the Green Climate Fund, or GCF, and the GEF, the Global Environmental Facility. Secondly, we conducted interviews with stakeholders to really understand the experiences and the challenges in this space for interaction and engagement for women's organizations and women's funds, speaking with both women's organizations and women's funds, as well as other staff from the financing mechanisms themselves, and other stakeholders such as accredited entities. And that really informed ultimately the pathways that we outlined for how we can increase engagement and what are some very straightforward seeming ways to engage. But as we will discover through this conversation, everything's not as straightforward as it seems, and there's still an incredible amount of capacity required. So as we look through the report structure, I think about the overview answering three basic questions, which is, what is climate finance? What's this history of gender within climate finance within this past decade primarily, and why women's organizations in climate finance? So just a slightly more in-depth discussion of some of the conversations that Bridget kicked off for us this morning. The second of the four parts of the report is really exploring these particular four climate finance funds. How do they operate? What are their gender policies and processes, and how have those developed over time? And then specifically, what are the engagement pathways for each of these funds? We then pivot to talk more about the challenges and the barriers, to really draw from the interviews and our experience with these funds to understand what is hindering the level of engagement that we want to see, that we all want to see with these funds, and then use that to inform some overall recommendations for how to engage, and doing this for both women's organizations, but also recognizing the proactive steps that the finance mechanisms and the implementing entities themselves should be taking. Within this, though, we realized that there were other ways that we needed to present this information. So that's when we decided to really focus on paring down a lot of the information into a streamlined document. And this brief provides a summary of the report, but represents some of the information in a slightly different order to really emphasize the 3 to 5 engagement pathways that we've identified for each of the 4 funds. And so that's a great place to start if you really want to focus on what's coming out of the report rather than some of the more history and the context around each of the funds and their development of their gender policies and processes over time. Secondly, the story that Balor is going to be sharing with you later in this presentation about the experience of the Mongolian Women's Fund is highlighted in several places throughout the report and the brief, but we felt that it was such an important and rich story that we really wanted to highlight it in a 3-page document to really serve as an example of the kinds of conversations and challenges that are happening around this engagement. Also important to note what the report doesn't do. It's not a full analysis or evaluation of how well gender has been integrated across these funds. We think that this history and the state of play is really important to understand where all the funds are, but we're not answering the question of, is it enough? And how well has it been operationalized by the funds in the various ways that they have considered and conceptualized gender within their policies and their structures and their mechanisms. And secondly, really to reemphasize something that Bridget brought up before, that even if these engagement pathways were followed, this doesn't get us to a gender responsive climate financing system. So this can't be read as a full roadmap and guide for doing that. It is part of the process of figuring out how that can be done and how this ultimately can be done, but this is not a panacea, nor are these engagement pathways a panacea. So when we're talking about the 4 funds, I just wanted to take a moment and think about how to compare them, recognizing that they each have very different structures and mechanisms. 3 of them are under the umbrella of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Some of them are growing Certainly since this table, which was last updated in March of 2019, the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund have both approved new projects. The Green Climate Fund now has 111 projects with 310 million beneficiaries. The Global Environment Facility, on the other hand, is really looking at a cyclical process, and so there will be more projects, but there aren't at the moment based on how their procedures work. So that just gives you a sense of the funds and the incredibly wide range of the amount of funding that they have, and as well as the number of countries they're serving and which countries they're serving. Certainly there are overlaps, but not necessarily. So there is a point at which understanding the way of engaging with these funds simply starts with understanding which funds are operating in your country or region of interest. Also, looking at this history of gender within each of the 4 funds, it's important to note that each of the funds now has a gender policy or an action plan or both. And we've highlighted here just a few of the key ways in which these policies or action plans connect with the idea of including women's organizations, including women's funds, or really engaging at the level that we want to see. And again, looking at this in terms of these are the policies and the procedures that are there, but understanding what is happening in practice is another ballgame altogether. So as we focus in on these engagement pathways, so what are the ways in practice that we can engage with these 4 funds? We have to recognize that there's just an incredible spectrum of the ways to engage, but at the same time, there's a lot of similarities, even across the funds, despite the fact that they have different operating structures and mechanisms. And engagement can really vary from the indirect to the direct, and we'll be diving into that in a couple of slides. But it also was really dependent on the ability of staff time and effort and technical capacity and resources to be dedicated to this engagement. And there's actually no simple or quick or easy way to engage. There is some level of time and effort required, which with each of these pathways, but of course between them, some of them are much more substantive than others. It's important to look at the way in which these pathways are not necessarily a set of prescriptive ideas. This is not a checkbox approach. This is a range of potential options. This shows what's possible, not necessarily what is advised, because ultimately each organization is going to have to make decisions of if to engage, and if so, how to engage based on your available networks and the strength of those networks that could be used to help leverage your ability to engage with your governmental focal points, for example, which funds are working in your region and the ways in which they're working with that regional variation, and how your organization operates and interacts, and the way that it enacts its mission and vision is really going to influence the different ways in which it may choose to engage. So I want to now talk about 3 of the different ways to engage and highlight some of the challenges associated with them. The first is observing, and we will see this across the engagement pathways in the report, that becoming an observer is certainly one way to engage as an organization. However, even that can be a somewhat bureaucratic process to become an official observer in certain cases. And even observing requires an understanding of some sense of how the fund operates and what types of language it uses. Being on a listserv is certainly a great way to start learning. Participating on that listserv can demand more of your time, especially when there's often short turnaround times for requests for input from civil society on various policies or projects. Being an official observer doesn't necessarily, in a lot of funds or any of them, entail having the resources to attend and observe the meetings in person. And so that's, another potential cost if you want to observe at that level. And then ultimately, so much of the best observing is happening in coordination and collaboration with other observers and stakeholders so that you can leverage each other's strengths. And it takes time and effort to develop and understand the ways in which these observers in this network interact and who can contribute their technical expertise or their historical knowledge. Another way of engaging is really focused on the idea of partnering and working and closely collaborating with governmental focal points of these funds or the entities that are ultimately implementing the projects themselves. And this is something that does take time in terms of building relationships, which is something Bolor is going to talk about more in her presentation. You may be able to build off previous relationships, but we also noted that a lot of the organizations that are the focal points for these funds are not necessarily the ones that you have a history with as a women's organization of interacting with. These might be ministries of finance or environment. And so entering their world where they too might not be as familiar with your work and what it means to be working on women's rights issues and gender equality issues means that it can be certainly a heavier lift in order for you to frame your value and the ways in which you want to collaborate to these other organizations. And even though we have this strong sense that each of the funds wants to have a level of engagement that they've outlined in their policies, we don't necessarily have set mechanisms for how that engagement will happen. So the process really is uncertain and is something that's going to be worked out over time, and why it's really important that we continue to share stories among women's organizations that are figuring out how to do this relationship building with the governments and the entities that are developing and implementing these proposals. And also just to note that there may be additional materials that you need to develop and present and provide in order to really highlight, again, the ways in which the particular expertise that women's organizations are adding can fit into these other structures that are not necessarily fit for purpose, that are, again, just not quite ready for this level of engagement or collaboration. That brings us to the third way of engaging, which is by far and away the most difficult and challenging, and one that is really uncertain and uncharted. It certainly may not even be possible within certain funds that do not have the ability for organizations beyond their already approved implementing entities to have that access to direct funding. Where it is possible, it can be an incredibly long technical process. And so we know that even though there's this demand and need to have funding flow directly to women's funds and organizations to do the work that we know needs to be done on the ground, that the mechanisms for that just are not there yet, and they're not robust. And so we really are hoping to learn from the few organizations that have really engaged with this as a possibility, and as they continue their processes of determining whether or not they can become accredited to a fund such as the Green Climate Fund and receive funds directly. More generally, though, we wanted to outline kind of 5 ways that women's organizations can engage. And the first is really about learning and specifying that learning within perhaps the specific fund that is of interest to really understand how that fund works and get a sense for it. And one of the ways that we wanted to highlight that people are all already learning are what you're doing right now joining this website can also join various listservs for the funds of interest. And then last year, we also did a 5-webinar series on women's rights and climate finance in conjunction with Both Ends and Gaga. So there's a lot of materials that are starting to be developed that we will continue to share with everyone that registered for this webinar, so that you can continue to develop your learning. And that's just crucial, and also figuring out how and whether you want to engage further. I wanted to highlight as well that one thing the report does is lay out key resources for each fund, as well as key resources overall, and recognizing that these key resources can range from the specific gender web pages of each of the funds to specific materials that the funds themselves have produced to materials that other civil society organizations have produced. And I wanted to just show 2 here from the Green Climate Fund civil society organizations, emerging from 2 different collaborations, one in 2016 on the left, one more recently, but both contain amazing principles and information and ways to learn more about that specific fund of interest. And we just want to recognize the ways in which our work in this report is drawing from this incredible body of work and years of advocacy and activism and learning on these different funds. Another way of engaging is really just taking advantage of the ability to connecting with governmental focal points, other civil society stakeholders, such as, for example, through the Adaptation Fund NGO network, attending various conferences that governmental entities or the funds themselves are putting on, and recognizing that there is just a large group of stakeholders out there that is really interested in turning more and more attention to these funds and trying to figure out where your networks can overlap with these other stakeholders. A third way of engaging is really speaking back to this idea of partnering with or collaborating with implementing entities. And so thinking about how to pitch yourselves to entities to show the ways in which your gender expertise can and should be fully integrated into the project, from the project development process through implementation, through monitoring and evaluation. And this is really something that the Mongolian Women's Fund has focused on. So I'm going to let Bolor really get into that story a little bit more when she presents. But I did want to highlight that right now there is an opportunity with the Adaptation Fund. But again, it's conditional. So even though there's this technical assistance grant for their environmental and social policy and gender policy that's available right now, it's available only to national implementing entities. So you'd have to determine whether your country is one of the 30 or so that has a national implementing entity. You'd have to contact your national implementing entity, discover during your communications with them whether they've already received technical assistance regarding the gender policy, because if they have, they might not be eligible for this grant that they're applying for, and then have this ongoing discussion with them about the ways in which you could potentially provide the capacity building, be contracted as part of this grant to help them improve their capacity and knowledge and understanding of operationalizing gender within their entity. So again, this is really kind of serving as an exemplar of the ways in which these these potential engagement pathways can still be full of challenges, even though we've identified the pathways. That's not enough. But there are important steps, such as developing a mapping tool of implementing entities that we can all start working on in order to think about the ways in which we want to build capacity or seek resources for building more capacity. So each of the different funds has their own project listings. Here's just an example from the CIF that could be used to understand what projects are in your area and specifically what different entities are working in your country or region of interest, because that can always be a starting point, again, of figuring out where these connection points might be with your existing networks. And then fifth, there's really an important research piece here that we know has to be ongoing, because we do need to better understand what capacity does exist. We do need to move beyond what we did in this report, which is looking at why women's organizations in general may not be connecting to this climate finance work, to look at it at the specific fund level, to look at their specific mechanisms and processes and policies. There's incredible value in looking specifically at how governments are accessing finance and how they're making decisions around the inclusion of stakeholders and how they're starting to think about that and developing potentially mechanisms for doing so. We do know of examples of civil society organizations that have reached out and said, this is the mechanism we think you should use to actually engage us. This is the way that we want to see this formalized. We also recognize that there's, again, such a space for documenting and analyzing the interactions that are happening so that we can learn from that and really build up that body of knowledge. And then lastly, recognizing that there's an entirely other tact and way of thinking about this, which is that there's always the opportunity, but not necessarily the resources, that we should be looking at the ways in which the gender activities within the current projects are being implemented. We don't want to just leave it there, because we do want to talk about what are some of the proactive steps that the finance mechanisms themselves and the implementing entities can take. And first of that is they need to understand which women's organizations are working in their region by reaching out to their governmental focal points for these different funds, reaching out directly to the women's funds and networks. And hopefully they too are looking at this report to identify the ways in which they can start thinking about supporting these efforts, or even codifying them into a regional database to understand potential key partners. And secondly, really intentionally taking all of these reasons that we know why women's organizations and women's funds engagement are so vital in this process, to think about how they're going to incorporate them into not just their future projects, but their past projects as well. What is their intentionality? What is the way in which they can really proactively do what needs to be done in order to create programs and projects that are ultimately more sustainable, and that are better serving the needs of their communities. And so while we hope that is taken to heart, we really want to continue doing this work of building our own capacity and sense of where these gaps are, so that we can better engage with these conversations with the finance mechanisms and the implementing entities. Someone who has done that really well is the Mongolian Women's Fund. And so I'm going to pass it over to Bolor to really talk about their experience and the key lessons and insights that they've taken away from it.
Thank you, Tara. Good evening, everyone. My name is Bolor, and I'm a program director at Mongolian Women's Fund. And I'm going to present the outcomes or our insights on our past year and half long work targeting the National Designated Authority of Green Climate Fund in Mongolia. So as Augusta mentioned earlier, we work to raise funds, to mobilize resources and support our grantee partners. And in 2014-15, many of the applications that we received were related to environment. They were related to impacts of climate change. So we expanded our work areas, and another way we entered new area of work, and we received a grant from International Women's Fund located in Germany, which works cross-regionally, FILIA, and which came with a helping hand. with an offer to give us information on what's going on with big funding. So the recommendation that one of the recommendations that we received was to commission a report to which will help us to understand the new area we are entering. And as part of this new area we identified Green Climate Fund. So when we commissioned the study, a research, our initial interest was to apply for funding to receive funding from Green Climate Fund. However, when 2 months later we read the report of the research, we were understandably disappointed because it pointed out that there is no direct access to local or national NGOs like ours. So I'm going to very quickly share with you the key recommendations that came out. And there were basically 5. The first one is to build a collaboration with an NDA. Second one was to cooperate for Green Climate Fund certification to provide our expertise. The third one was to work with Green Climate Fund funded projects and programs, which was too early. And fourth one was to conduct independent gender and social assessments of those projects. And the fifth one was to explore what are other opportunities. So again, based on our consultation with our national advisor, consultant who we hired to conduct this research, and also with other international organizations, including FILIA, both ends, WEDO, we focused on the first one, to build a relationship with NDA. And the reasons that we identified as a result of this consultation with various partners was that it is a key focal point at national level. So building a relationship with this focal point will help us to put ourselves in the structure, in the system that is that has an impact on this funding. Also, it was advised us that it is too early for us, especially in our case in Mongolia. I don't know about other countries, because at the time we commissioned the report and there was only one organization that received funding, and at the time it just received the funding, so others were not as relevant to us. So the next 3 slides that I'm going to share with you will be really our reflection on the past year and a half. And I just wanted to point out that our work is not over yet. We haven't achieved the results that we want to. So first of all, key lessons. Again, to repeat and to reiterate, there is no easy and quick way. It's been a year and a half and we are still have a lot to do to just build a relationship with the NDA and to put ourselves in the system and the structure. Secondly, knocking on door doesn't work. As it was mentioned earlier, those are government organizations, ministries. We don't have previous relationship with them. We don't have expertise in this area or experience. So finding the right person who can connect our organization with the NDA through their own network, through their own personal relationships, professional relationships is the key. And it is actually similar to many other areas of our work. When we start a new relationship, we do not just knock on the door, and we do not get upset when this door doesn't open. So it is something that was very essential in our work. And I should also recognize and acknowledge that accidentally, to our luck, the consultant that we hired to conduct the study happened to have this network, access to this network, had this relationship. So we elaborated on that and we leveraged on that relationship. The next one, criticizing or pointing, what NDA is not doing or not doing right, is not going to help. Again, it is so similar to many other our experiences. It is not always about protesting. It is not always about criticizing, especially when something new is under making. The next one is consistency of contacting and messaging is very important, but also we should be aware that it takes time. It was mentioned earlier that there is some gender blindness. So even though we present ourselves and we introduce ourselves as gender experts, as people who have worked in bringing, gender equality, protecting and promoting women's rights, they may not hear us. They may not understand why we are saying it, why it is important. So it takes time to offer, to consistently offer, and so that we can build this mutual trust. And on the other hand, to let them know that we are not going away. We are here and we will be here. So these are our key lessons. So if we move to the next slide, it is about key recommendations. And these may look orderly, but it is a result of our many discussions among ourselves with our partners. So I'm happy to share these recommendations with you. Again, it takes a lot of time, so prepare and plan for that, because there will be frustration, there will be disappointment, there will be moments when we feel like we're not progressing, we're not moving forward. But it is important to understand that it takes time, and there will come a moment when we will enter the new stage of relationship. And also it is important to shift this relationship from personal to organizational. So in our case, even though this relationship with the NDA started with help of our consultant, now eventually we are shifting to a relationship between two entities, two organizations. Another second recommendation, it is important to do some groundwork. And it was already mentioned before, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. Studying, reading, listening, participating in different events, going to forums. There are many at national level that are on environmental issues, on climate change issues. So just going there, listening, will help to build basic understanding that will help us to understand what other side is talking about, what NDA is talking about. And also it is important so that we can present in which area, in which part of this system or structure we can insert ourselves or take our place. Connecting with like-minded CSOs, especially those that work at international level and have built experience and knowledge and expertise on Green Climate Fund, helps a lot. We don't, again, fortunately, we had our network where we had access to those experts who were generously willing and were generously sharing whatever knowledge and experience they have accumulated, helping us to understand how it works and what shortcuts we can make, especially. So Also, the last one in our recommendation, it is important to identify what is your strength, what you can offer, especially what NDA does not have or know. And this is the strength, this is the offer that we come with to the NDA. So based on our recommendations, and again, based on our past work of year and a half, we have several insights that we are also happy to share with you. Next slide, please. So key insights. The first one, it is our right to be in this space. It is a new area, but whatever projects are funded through Green Climate Fund funding, whether it is about green jobs, whether it is rebuilding outskirts of the city, 50% of the population are women. And we are the experts on gender sensitizing government policies, projects, whatever. So we already have this right, and we are representing 50% of the population. The next one, we are the experts. And even though we are entering a new landscape, we are bringing this expertise. We're feminists, we are women's rights activists, we are gender experts, so no one can take it away from us. Even if we don't know the new landscape so well, still we know who we are, and we are bringing this expertise. And also, on the other hand, it is important to understand that we offered something they don't have. They don't have that gender expertise. They don't have like years, decades of this work, achievements, lessons. So they have gender policy, but they have no expertise whatsoever. And on the other hand, NDA is building their own system and structure at national level. And it is important for us to be there to ensure that we are there sooner rather than later, because once all policies, processes are in place, it will be more difficult for us to engage. So it is important to become part of this building so that the policies and structures are gender responsive, and not only gender responsive on paper, because through our organization, we are bringing women's movement representatives into this structure and system and decision making especially. So just to share where we are right now, we have built a relationship at institutional level with the NDA. And right now we are working on putting ourselves, because no one is inviting us, we are working on putting ourselves at this table where one of the seats is permanently ours, whether it is at a gender advisory group or some other committees, but we have to be there. And this is where what we are working on right now. But again, it took us 1.5 years to realize that and to come to this point where we are so confident and comfortable actually saying that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Balor, for those insights. And I think that overall, you know, the experience and sort of the task that the Mongolian Women's Fund has taken on is one that we know we have examples of from other colleagues as well, of taking that first step in building the relationship with the NDA or the NIE, the implementing entity or designated authority, whomever, whichever ministry or organization or structure is and has the capability of accessing climate finance in your country and building a relationship with them. And certainly getting more insights on that, including from you, I think is part of the work that we are all trying to do so that we can build understanding of best practice and case studies, and really with full knowledge of the fact that it's very dependent on different countries and a number of different circumstances. So at this point, I think we can open up for questions. I've already seen a few questions come forward in terms of, you know, where, as a women's organization, if I have a project and a demand that I want to submit to one of these funds, where do I do that and who can help me with the project? And I think that that is very, it's a very clear question that we often receive from lots of different women's organizations. And I actually think it's part of the reasons why outlining these engagement pathways became really critical, because there is no straightforward answer to that question. So I will hand over to Tara or anyone else who wants to give any response to that, because again, not only is it not it's not necessarily specific, but it is different depending on the different funds that we mentioned. There are some that do have windows for direct access. So while others maybe think of questions that they have, if anyone wants to feedback on that, please feel free to.
So the two funds right now that have the most windows set up for direct access are the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund. However, the Green Climate Fund's window for direct access has not really been taken up in the way that it needs to be, kind of at the country level, for the countries to then offer these subgranting opportunities. So there's really only one or two countries that are doing that right now, but we continue to push as civil society organizations for there to be increased uptake of this enhanced direct access procedure, so that that can really become a hallmark of the Green Climate Fund, really drawing from the lessons that have been learned from the Adaptation Fund. The Adaptation Fund does the best job with its small grants facility of having the potential for funding projects directly. And then, of course, kind of taking these set of ideas around engagement pathways, looking at funding a project can also entail having these conversations again with national implementing entities, or whatever designated entities for the fund will be implementing projects, and trying to get your project ideas into their scope of work, trying to see if they can contract with you to help deliver part of your project as part of their larger programs or projects, or really engaging at the governmental level as projects are being developed, so that your ideas are feeding into really a project pipeline of ideas that are being developed over time among multiple stakeholders. So again, this kind of goes back to this idea of relationship building, and there not necessarily being these specific steps for getting a project that you have completely ready to get funding for it right now, outside of a few narrow options within just a few of the funds.
And just to maybe add on that, to clarify a couple of things I think that are really important when we talk about direct access. Tara mentioned the fact that the GCF has this idea of enhanced direct access, but that is really not related to a women's organization putting forward a project and being able to directly access funds in that way. When we talk about direct access in that way, we talk about countries being able to designate entities that can then have direct access. If we looked at different funds themselves, some of the different challenges that we see coming up to, I'm sorry, if you could please mute yourself if you're not speaking. I'm just going to mute. Is that the size of the projects themselves are way beyond the scope of what many of us would conceive of as a project. So we're talking, the tens of millions of dollars. And so there are entities like the GEF, the Global Environmental Facility, has a small grants program, for example, where we have seen projects being funded through different groups. But one of the, I would say, opportunities of the GCF is, unlike other funds which rely on intermediaries such as the multilateral development banks, which requires a whole other kind of relationship building with the MDBs. For example, specifically the climate investment funds is a fund that is solely implemented through multilateral development banks. So that requires an engagement with those MDBs, and it requires the MDBs to really know of your organization to be able to put something forward. If we're talking about something like the GCF, there is this opportunity for different types of groups to become accredited entities. So you have organizations like Conservation International or the International Union on the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, who, for example, as a women's organization, you might have a different kind of relationship with or a deeper relationship with. And in that case, there's the opportunity to pitch them on projects, as Tara said, or to build a relationship with them. So I would say it's not only just within your country, but it's really looking at that list of implementing entities and seeing where there might be an opportunity to have a conversation with someone about different projects that can uplift or replicate or scale something that you're doing. And that's why there's that multiple approach of who are the people that we would like to see as implementing entities, and who are the people that we would like, who are the people that we would like to see as implementing entities and trying to encourage them to do so. And then secondly, what are the different pathways if I have an idea? And so again, it's depending on where you're starting from. If you know you are working on a solar solution across different households and it needs to be scaled, it needs to be replicated, it is about trying to think of what those pathways are. And as an example, we do, and the Women and Gender constituency each year engage in awards project called the Gender Just Climate Solutions, where we highlight solutions that need to be scaled and funded, that are women-led, are low emissions, and part of the emphasis on finding those projects and solutions is then working on mentorship, relationship building with the different entities to see how they can access funding. So finding and highlighting those solutions. If you find that you have a project that you think should be funded through a climate finance mechanism, I would say one of the first things you should be doing is making sure you're part of these networks like the Women and Gender constituency or the mailing list to the funds, so that you have access to the groups that are trying to make these connections. Were there any other questions? I don't see any written in the chat box, but you can unmute yourself if you would like to ask anything. Rosemary?
Well, I just wanted to thank you so much. This has been a really important session for me and for my organization. I think we really have learned a lot. What I was asking is, how could we reach out to you in case we have more questions that we don't have right now? Later on, maybe after this session, just as a matter of follow-up on what we have gotten today.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's funny because as we were having this conversation in my mind, I was thinking of things that we need next, like a climate finance question hotline or some sort of key place where you can direct any questions that you have. Because I would say the answer to that is, of course, you can be in touch with colleagues who are on this call, and when we send the notes and the presentations and the recording of this out, we can also share contacts that you might want to be part of. Something we didn't actually go through in the presentation, but it is given as an example in the report, is that in trying to develop these engagement pathways, particularly for the Green Climate Fund, one of the approaches was to set up regional feedback channels that are led by different what are called GCF gender monitors. And I think that those with the have the potential to broaden out even bigger than the GCF if there's more time capacity. So it could be both the contact to any one of us to, of course, ask any specific question, but then also to share with you how you could get engaged in the regional networks that we have that exist, that are looking specifically at gender and the Green Climate Fund. And that might also be a good space or an avenue for asking questions and engaging.
Thank you very much. I'm grateful.
Excellent, thank you. Are there any other questions? There's one from Sarah. Would you like to read that out, or would you like me to read it for you? So there's a question about, or a comment about, the G7 is currently taking place, and there was an aim to push for more integration of obligation of the G7 states towards gender issues and green solutions as priority areas for funding projects, and hoping this will be accepted. And I think actually that's a comment that's useful towards the whole broader landscape, because as Tara mentioned, as Balor mentioned, a whole challenge here is that there's still, even with work done to integrate gender across the different multilateral instruments, there's still a big block for, particularly when it comes to country levels, where ministries of finance or ministries of environment who are in charge of putting together the proposals on projects for these funds are not gender responsive or gender sensitive in their own thinking about climate change and what climate change action looks like. So there's still a lot of work to be done with national governments as well as decision makers and funders to help them understand this really inextricable link between gender equality and climate change, and how you need to include it to build effective climate actions. And so things that was just mentioned here, where we have groups that are pushing this advocacy in different spaces such as the G7. There's a commitment being put forward to the climate summit happening in September on gender as an integral part of gender responsive action, or as climate action. And so the more and more we have countries committing to this intersection, the more we can hold them accountable to the type of funding proposals that are being put forward. And I think that only helps to kind of get us past this challenge where we're still getting projects that are gender blind, and should hopefully help open doorways for different groups to be able to engage. And the more capacitated women's organizations and feminist groups can be to be ready when that door opens, I think the better off we will all be. I don't see, so there's some more comments, and there's a question. We will share the video of the webinar. I'm going to pass over to Tara or Balor or Augusta if anyone wants to add anything to some of the questions or any final comments.
I'd like also to share our learning, which I didn't mention here, but probably it is something very obvious. It is not necessarily that NDA, in our case, it is at the Ministry of Environment, is gender blind by choice. It is not their area of expertise, and when they do not hear us,
voilà, c'est ça. C'est exactement ça. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a toutes les activités qui vont être...
Go ahead.
When they do not hear us or they do not accept us, it doesn't necessarily mean that they do it consciously. And it is a lot about raising their awareness, helping them to understand, and helping them to realize that this is in their interest to collaborate with us because of the gender policy of Green Climate Fund. So this is something that, on a positive note, that I wanted to share.
Excellent. Augusta, Tara?
So I just wanted to reiterate something that you were just talking about, Bridget, and the need of all of these other things that we need to create so that we can continue this conversation, and this idea that really this is the beginning of a conversation or an ongoing part of a conversation that various folks have been engaging with over the years, not a presentation of a report that is going to conclude the conversation. So after this webinar, you will be receiving an email that has some of the resources that we've mentioned, such as the new video on gender responsive climate finance. You all have my contact information. I'll share contact information of other folks so that as you're reading and working through the brief or the Mongolian Women's Fund example or the report, and as you have questions and comments, we can continue to have conversations and discussion about that. And hearkening back to this idea that we were talking about earlier of the importance of really like sharing our various stories so that we can learn from them, and really want to appreciate so much of the insights that Bolor was able to share with us, so that knowing still that any process is going to have its own challenges that cannot be predicted, that she's better prepared us for this journey and for the various shapes that these journeys might take for each of us in our organizations. And so, yeah, just really wanted to end on this idea of this being a beginning and a space for continuing interaction rather than a one-time webinar, even though you will, of course, be receiving this recording of the webinar is one of the many resources that you can reference, and one of the many ways that we'll continue to have spaces for these conversations.
Thank you, Tara. Augusta, anything from you?
I guess I think as we think about next steps and understanding that this was sort of an initial foray into giving an introduction to the different climate finance mechanisms, it would be helpful as folks reflect on what they learned today in the webinar and perhaps read through the different pieces, sort of understand what's resonating in terms of where organizations see they want to take action or conduct further research, and where support would be the most useful. And so if there are anything, anything related to that anybody on this webinar wants to share now of what they're thinking or are already planning on doing, that would be great. But I think as much as we can continue to share that, it would just be helpful in knowing where to sort of further this research.
Yeah, I think that that's a really great point, Augusta. And what we'll do when we send it out is we also, in addition to welcoming any feedback that people would like to share, we can also include a short survey so you could add in feedback as well. And just on those pieces, it would be really good to know, if people on this call feel like my organization, the fund I work with, has the capacity or would like to be doing more. We've had some feedback from some people already sharing their email, saying that they want to think about what the next steps might be with the fund that they work with, etc. So that would be really useful information to get. And also a question on translation. So we have a series of webinars that have happened previously as well that were translated into French and Spanish. And so in addition to sending out this resource, I think we can also link you to those as well so that you can find some of those pieces. We do endeavor where possible to make sure that things are translated in at least Spanish and French. And hopefully we can get back and review and see where, particularly with the briefs that we've provided, we might be able to do that as well. Were there any other final comments that anybody wanted to add? Anybody else on the call? Thank you for sharing your emails in the chat box and your information. If not, I am going to just thank Augusta and Tara and Bolor for their inputs and everyone on the call for staying with us and for being engaged and asking questions, and really welcome you to continue to stay engaged and to reach out to us with questions and comments as we think about the path forward to building and sustaining capacity in these spaces. So thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.